So, welcome back to Chapter 1, Part 2, and continuing on with the Earth. So now we're kind of narrowing our focus. And the next thing we'll talk about is tectonics. The surface of the Earth is not solid. And I don't know if that maybe shocks some people. The best way I can describe the Earth, we're not going to go into the detail too much, but deep down in the Earth, it's so warm that rocks act almost like they're liquid. The outer surface of the Earth is not one solid piece of rock. It's actually many shells or plates, and they call these tectonic plates. And this map shows you many of them. Think about this. Think about this analogy. Imagine a soft-boiled egg, right? You got the eggshell, and the egg inside is kind of still squishy. If you cracked the eggshell but didn't peel it, right, you'd have these kind of pieces right here, and they could move against each other, couldn't they, or move apart or squish around. And that's what happens. These large plates can move on top of the liquid rock underneath it. Okay? And that's the part of the Earth we call the mantle. Okay? These plates are constantly moving, very slowly, maybe 1 centimeter or half an inch every year. But it adds up. And over time, these movements create landforms like volcanoes. They can be responsible for earthquakes and other landforms as well. How do we know where these boundaries are? Well, you can actually map earthquakes and volcanoes. So these little red triangles map known volcanoes. These areas that are orange are what they call earthquake belts, where earthquakes happen. And you can see that they basically follow these plate boundaries. One interesting note here is the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Plate is surrounded by a ring of volcanoes. If you notice all these plate boundaries, they actually call it the Pacific Ring of Fire. Some of the world's most intense, largest volcanoes and some of the strongest earthquakes happen here. But what's interesting is, because these plates move, we know that over time, all these pieces of Earth have been in many different positions. So if we go back roughly 200, 300 million years ago, we have what's called Pangaea. And this just shows you kind of what it looked like. So here's the United States, here's South America, and here's Africa. And if you ever notice how Africa and South America fit like a puzzle, that's exactly what. And over time, in the course of the last 250 million years, they've gradually broken up and split back together, back and forth. Right now, we are currently on a breakup. Most of the continents have moved apart. But in the future, they will actually come back together. What's interesting, though, is the movement of these plates can create environmental stressors like earthquakes, volcanoes, and it can separate land masses. And these have a huge impact on life on Earth. In fact, for human evolution, it's thought that an earthquake and volcano that occurred here in what is now the Philippines or the Indonesia, called Mount Tambora, was so severe 70,000 years ago. It put out so much ash and dust into the air that it blocked the sun. It was so cold that many plants and animals died. And at one point, 70,000 years ago, we think that humans went down to about 10,000 people total in the entire planet, which may sound like a lot, but that is almost going extinct. It wouldn't take much for that to happen. Okay. Also, we think it's been responsible for global climate change. As these volcanoes and earthquakes and continents move, it affects the weather patterns. 55 million years ago, you notice India, right here, was not attached to Asia like it is today. This collision, India moved over 50 million years, basically like this, and ran right into Asia, created the Himalayan mountains. And that process changed worldwide climate. 60 million years ago, it was so hot. It was 25 degrees warmer than it is now. And there was no ice anywhere on the planet, even at the South Pole. And the process of India colliding with Asia changed the climate so much that it dropped to what we currently have. So that ring of fire I told you about, one of the parts of that ring is called the Indo-Australian Eurasian Plate Boundary. So let me go back to the map. Okay, so right here, this is the Indo-Australian plate boundary, the Indian plate and the Australian plate. They're moving pretty fast, so the boundary here between the Eurasian plate has some of the fastest movement, and that creates some of the strongest earthquakes and the biggest volcanoes in the world. Okay, very active. So Mount Toba is the volcano I told you about 70,000 years ago that almost wiped humanity off the face of the earth. Another volcano in the same area, Krakatoa in 1883, was so loud when it exploded, they could hear the explosion in Japan. And let me give you some distance. That would be the same as if something happened in Boston, hearing it in Los Angeles. Okay? In 2004, an earthquake on this boundary caused a tsunami in the Indian Ocean that killed almost 500,000 people the day after Christmas. When we look at life on Earth, and as far as we can tell, life arose about roughly 3.5, 2 billion years ago. There have been several cycles of mass extinctions. A mass extinction is when over I believe it's 70% of all life goes extinct. Now, how do we know that happened? If we look at fossils, say 65 million years ago, and we find all these fossils of dinosaurs and other animals and plants, and then 64 million years ago, we don't find them anymore. That means they went extinct. Because there's no animals alive, there's no animals to die and create new fossils. We see that there have been 5 peaks of extinctions, 5 spikes. Okay? We kind of think we have an idea of why they happened. We're pretty sure the dinosaur extinction that happened 65 million years ago, which is probably the one that you're all famous was the result of an asteroid the size of New York City plowing into the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. And it created so much dust from the atmosphere that it basically blocked up the sun for years. It poisoned the rain so that it killed all the plants. 95% of all life on the surface goes extinct. Nothing larger than the size of a chicken survived, which is interesting in a sense, and I'll tell you why, is that when that happened, that gave rise for mammals. These are the other extinctions that we talk about. You can see that the Permian extinction killed almost 96% of all life on Earth. So that was very close to everything. But the extinction of dinosaurs, about 65 million years ago, what happens is all of a sudden all of the large land animals are gone. The only animals that survived were very small, of which one of them were small mammals. At the time, most mammals were small, almost like mouse or shrews living underground, very, very tiny. But they were able to take advantages because as the weather got better and the earth started to reheal and plants came back, there were no large animals to stand in their way. And that leads to what we call the age of mammals, beginning 65 million years ago up to today. And in fact, about 1.8 million years ago, we see the rise of man. Okay? Now, man is part of a family of life called hominid. Hominids are animals that are mammals that walk on 2 feet. Okay? So we are the only hominid today. There have been several other species, but they've all gone extinct, such as Australia's Athapicopithecus. I never can say these. Homo neanderthalis, Homo denisovian. These are all extinct hominids that arose about 4 million years ago. Most of the fossils that we find, the evidence that we look at for these ancient hominid species, tends to cluster right here in Eastern Africa. So today, the best guess when we come to science, the evidence would tend to suggest that this is where the ancestors of humans evolved. And not only do we find the fossils there, but our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, still live in this area today. So a lot of evidence would suggest this is where humans evolved, beginning about 4 million years ago. Now, as I mentioned, today we are the only hominid species alive. There are no other hominids, upright walking mammals. Chimpanzees, gorillas may do it for a little bit, but not all the time. In fact, most of the time they walk on all fours. But in the last several million years, at some time there were up to 8 different species. Okay? What's interesting is, in the time that I've taught this class, in the last 4 years, DNA evidence has revolutionized how we view life. With DNA evidence, it gives us a whole new window. We can look at the DNA, and with mathematical modeling, we can actually look back and find many different things in the DNA and find out even more about life on Earth, and it's changing, as we'll talk about a lot in the video that I'm going to have you watch this week about the Great Human Odyssey, about how life arose and how modern humans came to populate the Earth. But that's our next thing, the humanized world. The current consensus is all modern humans today are descended from people that lived in this area of Africa about 100,000 years ago. 100,000 years ago, populations began to migrate throughout the world, eventually reaching all the way into South America and Australia and Asia. This map just kind of shows you. Okay. Now, this doesn't mean that we might not find evidence to contract that. Maybe 100 years ago, scientists believed, because the fossils they found were that humans evolved here in Europe. Some believe they evolved in Asia. Some believe that they evolved in both places independently. So that can change. The best evidence we have now suggests this area of Africa. But we do know that between 100,000 years ago and about 10,000 years ago, humans came to basically populate every part of the world except for Antarctica. Okay? Now, how do we know this? A couple things. Well, one thing is genetic variation. When we look at the DNA of an individual in a population, every time you're born, right, you get DNA from your mother, DNA from your father. You get half from one parent, half from the other, and they're combined. So it's something new. And when they do that, if you think about, right, they're copying the genes from one half one up, and they're making a new gene. And then those genes are copied as you grow more cells, more genes are copied. It's kind of like a copy machine, right? If there's sometimes a slight little error, maybe one letter, one gene gets misplaced, and then that copy gets passed on. The longer back you go, right, the more variation there is, because every time someone is born, there's a little bit more variation, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. So if a population of people has a very high variation within their DNA, so say you look at the population of a group of people who are living in India, and the population of a group of people living in Africa, and the people in Africa have a much higher variety of genes or variation within their gene pool, what that tells you is that they have been there longer. It takes more time to create more variation. And when we do genetic studies, when we account for where people have lived for most of the time, the oldest populations tend to be right here in South Africa. Another thing we find is distance decay effect. In other words, as you go further and further from the source of something, it changes, it evolves. And so we find that the genes and practices also change. The movie that I'm going to have you watch, The Great Human Odyssey, really explains these much better than I can, so keep that in mind. Now, sometimes people see this and they think that it was just one continuous process. Humans left Africa and went this way, and some went that way, and it was just constant. It really wasn't. It was more like budding. So the first group leaves Africa into Saudi Arabia, Israel, and they're there maybe a couple hundred years, and then parts of their population move, and over time another part moves this way and this way. It wasn't like people planned, let's go and colonize Asia. They just went over that next hill or into that next valley or across that river and slowly covered the whole world. But one of the more interesting ones was during the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago. There was so much ice in the world that had taken water out of the oceans to freeze. The oceans were about 400 feet lower than they are today. It basically dried up the water between Alaska and Russia, and it allowed people to just walk right into North America. All right, I'm going to pause right here. Time to refill on your snacks, and we'll come back with part 3 in just a moment.